Hi, I'm Robin Newman, and I am from here, which is Snug Recording Company, which is a little studio in Derby. And this is Joe.
Hello, my name is Joe Caithness. I am a mastering engineer. I run Joe Caithness Mastering, based in Nottingham, and we have worked together on quite a few projects. And we were both talking at around the Christmas time, and everybody was having some time off and working out what they're going to do for the next year, about doing some videos to help sort of non-professionals, musicians, people who are working from home, people who are sort of doing independent releases with the audio side of things. So that's everything from the very, very first stage to actually getting it online, and between us we sort of do all those stages. So the idea for this video is to basically introduce how to actually prepare what you've got. So when you're working with a professional and you're sending files over or sending information over, what are some best practices, and sort of from our experience, what can anecdotally go right or wrong?
I think we've got plenty of experience of both those.
And sort of just to try and help speed things up for people, and also demystify some of the processes, and hopefully clarify some of the things linguistically, because a lot of people use different words and different phrases and terminology for what is actually quite a simple thing. And I think that can sometimes scare people. It scared me in the past.
When we say sort of, sending stuff to a professional engineer, and when we sort of say that we want to explain things for non-professionals, we mean that in the nicest way, in terms of you shouldn't have to be worrying about all of that, the technology of this stuff. You shouldn't have to learn half of what the engineer working for you has spent time learning. That's what they're there for. But there is a certain amount of kind of onus that ends up sitting on the musicians and on the artists as well. And hopefully we can help with a bit of that.
It's the same as with any service, really. If you're paying somebody to do something, you need a certain amount of information so that they can provide the service to you. And the idea here is to sort of fill that gap so that you don't sort of get an email and have to start Googling stuff, and then, asking your friends and sort of getting a bit waylaid, when really you should be thinking about the creative process, because that's your side. And like I say, we're being paid to do the other side.
So hopefully this helps you not kind of undermine your own project.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
So the first area that we wanted to cover is the absolute basic, which is the actual audio itself. So the stuff that you've made, the stuff that you've recorded, how that should be prepared. So we're going to come on to other things about sending the audio and what to send with the audio. But this is more sort of like, you've finished all your creative stuff, you've put the guitar away, you've stopped messing about with the chords and everything. What's the next step? So probably the best thing to do is to do it in the order of a project. And as you do the earlier stuff, maybe we can lead on how to maybe get something out of a DAW and then send it to somebody, for example, to mix.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that we will probably not have time to go into too many specifics of each bit of software, because there are so many out there that you might be using to create your music with. But there are some sort of main things that will always hold true. So if, like a lot of people, maybe you demo your music first at home, so maybe you work on an iPad, maybe you work in Logic or in Fruity Loops or any bit of software that you might create music in. If you're then bringing some of that audio into a studio to then either record more parts over, like record your vocals onto a track you've been working on, record acoustic instruments, things like that, and to do mixing work, we need to have certain things in place to be able to smoothly kind of bring that audio into our system and be able to work with it. So one of the first things is, if you're working in a DAW or something like that, a lot of the time you might be dropping in different places to record things. You might be, sort of the intro's on guitar, the keyboards don't come in till later, things like that. The thing that we really need if we're coming over from other bits of software is for all of your exported audio files to start at the beginning. of the whole session. So not at the beginning of when you start playing. So even if it means that you're exporting with a load of silence at the start of a lot of your tracks, that's fine. Digital silence is not a problem. We don't get any more noise from that or anything like that. It's not like days of tape. So we're looking at all those things starting at one particular cue point so that they'll all sync up. Otherwise, we have to sync things manually, and that can be a real pain. So that's one thing that's really important. There are lots of options within most DAWs to be able to export your audio starting from 0. Each one varies slightly, but usually you can search for it. It's often called consolidating audio or exporting consolidated tracks, bouncing all tracks rather than bouncing all clips or something like that, or all regions. It tends to be something like that. The terminology will tend to skew towards a track is the whole length of a track, anything usable on it from the very start right the way through. Whereas when we talk about clips or regions, we're usually talking about smaller chunks of audio, and they might sit in more of a kind of patchwork arrangement in the software.
One thing as well, when you're exporting, be very aware of any like groups or buses that you've created. So often, if you're mixing, most styles of music will have some element of grouping in it. And you need to be aware that if that group has processing on it, if you just export one channel, you need to know if that, say, compression, EQ, anything like that that's happening, reverb, whether that's actually happening on that channel as well, and whether you want that, because there are times where you will add like creative effects, say on a vocal, and you want to provide that to the mixer with those effects on.
Yeah, I think the point about buses, or sometimes they're called aux tracks or sends or returns, all those kind of things, basically we start to talk about the architecture of the mixer. So you might have tracks where you can send audio to another place that has a reverb on it and things like that. Or you might group a bunch of tracks, like all your drum tracks might go through one group track that you then can apply compression to or some effect or whatever. The tricky part is that if you want us as mixers to have control over each of those individual elements and be able to EQ a kick drum and blah, 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 we are probably not going to be able to use that stemmed down stereo track. If it sounds great, we'll use it. And by all means, bring it in as an option. But one thing that could be really useful is if you are bussing down tracks like that, or doing any group effects, or providing dry copies of things that did have effects. If you even just taking a screen grab of the plugin settings or something like that, we can usually look at a plugin and work out translating that to something that we have that's similar. So a lot of the time that can be helpful as well in trying to combat or trying to manage the expectations of what you want it to sound like at the end, because I think a lot of people during the writing process can get demoitis, as some people call it, where they become very familiar with how they've made it sound. And we don't want to necessarily take your music in a completely different direction to what you did when you created it. We just want to do it with as much control and as much relation between the different tracks in the session as possible. Yeah.
And in that case, one good practice is to provide both. So provide the sort of produced version of the vocal and the raw one. And often sometimes, we'll come to this later as well, we'll talk about notes and stuff, but it might be useful to describe what you've done just in a sentence, so that when the person who's receiving the audio can arrange that in their own DAW. By the way, DAW, same thing, that means computer software for making music and doing stuff, if anybody's unsure of that terminology. And just make the person aware that there has been some processing done, because it might be that you don't want to add anything more to that lead vocal, or that guitar might want to stay completely dry, so those things, when you're actually exporting, just be aware that there might need to be a few different versions of each thing. It might even just be for backup. It might just be to reference, to have a quick listen to, but make sure you export that at the same time, not later on where you might have adjusted something or changed a level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then you get into all kinds of issues. And also as well, like when you're being creative, and I've done this myself as well, there is a tendency to sort of just, which is a topic of a whole other video perhaps, but just chuck stuff on, move the gain around, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, you write quick, you edit slowly.
Yeah, and then you need to be aware that stuff that you've done, it needs to actually be able to work in the next stage. So you might have gone a bit mad and started pushing the levels up, and you might have clipped it, for example. You might have added some sort of phaser effect on it or something, and you just need to be aware that it's going to have to add up again at a later stage. So just be really careful that you don't do anything which is going to, and again, this is a topic of another video perhaps, but things that won't join back up. So crazy effects have a lot of phase things going on, or delays that have a lot of stereo stuff going on. Just be aware that once the guitars, for example, are panned, or once the new vocals are added that you might do later on, that you're going to have that there. So be conservative, maybe do a few different versions. If it is some sort of mad experimental thing, just be aware of the limitations later on. And again, that's that expectation management thing that's really big.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point about clipping and things like that. I know I've seen a lot of people when they're first starting out making tracks. One of the things that I think is a real sort of, I mean, I'm not going to say that it's a bad design in DAW software or something, but to people that don't come from a recording background, I think the fact that all your faders will start at 0 dB, which is quite high. So the tendency can be, and especially when you're working with virtual instruments and software instruments, they're often very loud comparatively. We would maybe, when we're recording acoustic instruments here, for instance, we will often be quite conservative with the amount of gain that we're applying to things, because when we're working with very clean modern digital systems that do not introduce a great deal of noise to the signal. So we don't have to record loud. So a lot of the time when you're creating music, especially electronic stuff and things where you're working in software instruments, it's very easy to get into the red on those meters. And I would say, a lot of the time, my first port of call is whenever I make a new track, when I'm creating music, just take the fader down a little bit. We don't need to work at really loud levels. Just anything software instruments, I will usually take it down about 10 dB or something, so that then if I'm recording acoustic stuff like vocals or a guitar over it or things like that, I'm matching a lower volume as I record, rather than trying to turn up the gain and hit things to match the loud sort of sampled instruments that I'm using and things like that. One
thing that sort of moves it onto what I was going to talk about, which is preparing stuff for mastering, is also being aware that you've got in a DAW, you've got a couple of different things. You've got the faders on the actual channels, then you've got the master fader as well. And if your master fader is clipping, you need to turn that down. And if your individual faders are clipping, you need to turn those down. You have to be aware of the relationship between them, because if you're about to export and you think, oh, that the red light's coming on here and here and here, you need to be really aware of where you're doing it and where you're moving those faders, because. And again, maybe we'll do another video on gain structure, but it's a really big thing, and it's the sort of thing that people learn the hard way generally.
Yeah.